After 6 long months, the Canadian Premier League is finally back, as next week the 2023 Canadian Premier League season kicks off, the 5th season in the history of the league. It was a very eventful offseason for the Canadian Premier League. FC Edmonton folded, Vancouver FC joined the league as an expansion team and built their first squad. We had a couple major coaching changes, a couple big player transfers to Europe. Just a lot of stuff happened for an 8-team league in this past winter. And every change that happened over the winter built up to what should be the most competitive and tight-fought season in Canadian Premier League history. So this is my preview for the 2023 Canadian Premier League season. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically predict each team's place in the regular season, and as I go up, starting from 8 and up to 1 as to where I think teams are going to finish, I'm going to do a bit of a preview for each team. So let's start things off with number 8. Unfortunately, I have the Halifax Wanderers. Halifax is probably the biggest unknown team coming into this season. They have new coach Patrice Geyser, who has never managed at the professional level, coming in as the former coach of the Vaughan Azzurri in League One Ontario. Geyser led the Azzurri to the 2022 League One Ontario Championship, and also interestingly enough, he actually managed the Vaughan Azzurri in 2019 during their Canadian Championship matchup against the Halifax Wanderers. So that's an interesting little bit of history between Geyser and his new team. The Wanderers had the most roster turnover of any team in the CPL this season. They have 16 new signings on a 23-man squad. That is a ridiculous amount. And also what's very noticeable about them is they are a very young team. A lot of young players, a lot of unknown players on this Halifax team. That doesn't bode well for predictive power and predictive strength at the beginning of the season, for ranking them at the beginning of the season, because they just have a bunch of young guys that frankly I know barely anything about. And so it's very hard to accurately judge that before the season started, before we've seen a ball be kicked, how this Halifax team is going to do. It's also question marks as to where their offense is going to come from this season, as Samuel Salter, who was their top scorer last season and actually finished 4th in league scoring last season, was sold to Atletico Ottawa over the winter, and João Morelli is still out until the mid-season this year because of that injury he picked up very early on in 2022. Morelli's not expected to come back until mid-summer of this year. So especially in the first half of the season before Morelli comes back, this team is going to need to find someone new to be able to score, someone who doesn't have that repertoire at the professional level just yet. But for right now, they just don't have the experience to justify putting them any higher up in the predictions. At number 7, I have Winnipeg's Valour FC. Valour's a team that had an intriguing offseason. They lose Sean Ray as his loan ends and he goes back to Montreal, and after his incredible season last year, Montreal seems to be keeping him in the Major League Soccer lineup for 2023. They lose a couple other key pieces, Rocco Romeo going to Vancouver, Brett Levi going to the USL Championship. So Valour left in a tough spot in terms of some of their established players heading out. In terms of what they've brought in, I'm not sure what they've brought in matches what they've lost. Pacifique Nyangabire is an interesting pickup up front. Ditto for Dante Campbell in the midfield. They've acquired some interesting pieces in the offseason that could perform well in the Canadian Premier League. It's just that the guys they've brought in aren't really that established players, so they could perform very well in the Canadian Premier League and do very well for Valour, but what they've kept over from last season, what they've brought in to supplement it, hasn't really convinced me that they're going to be fighting for a playoff spot. Moving on to number 6, I have new expansion team Vancouver FC. Vancouver FC joined the CPL, and with their first couple signings made it very clear they were not pulling an FC Edmonton and just floating. They were adding an 8th team that was actually going to compete in the CPL in their first season. They got some very, very nice pickups from other CPL teams and guys like Rocco Romeo, Callum Irving, Gabriel Bitar, all very nice pieces on this Vancouver team. Also add to that Caden Chun, who was a fantastic right back in the Canadian Premier League with Pacific, had a decent trial with Toronto FC last season season, although he couldn't really stick around. So you're adding in a right back with some MLS experience there. And then also, Gael Sandoval is such a potential X factor for this Vancouver team. He could be elite in the Canadian Premier League. He could be a superstar player in this league if he settles in well in Vancouver and if everything goes well and he meshes with the whole team. It'll be interesting to see him perform in the Canadian Premier League, but he could be an X factor where if he comes and he has a fantastic season, it could potentially elevate Vancouver into a playoff spot. Right now I have them on the fringe just outside of the playoffs, but they're definitely a team to watch and definitely are set up to have a very good season for an expansion team. Up to number 5 and the first playoff spot in this new playoff format, I have Pacific FC. Pacific is a team where since they won their 2021 CPL championship, I feel like their roster has slowly deteriorated as they've lost pieces from that title group and haven't really fully replaced them with equal caliber players. This past offseason, they lost Marco Bustos, who was their just creative maestro throughout the last couple seasons. And also, of course, Alejandro Diaz will not be partaking any part of this season with Pacific FC after leaving halfway through last season. Pacific is a team that they saw a notable decrease last season following the departure of Diaz. They basically rode the first half of the season where he was scoring at an insane rate in the Canadian Premier League into a playoff spot, but everyone kind of knew going into the playoffs that of the 4 teams in the playoffs, they were the team with the lowest chance of winning. That being said, for all the losses of players they've suffered, they did manage to get Easton Ongaro this offseason, and that is a massive signing for Pacific. Ongaro is the striker air replacement for Diaz that they did not have in the end of last season. Ongaro was a guy who was scoring at a fairly decent clip on a 2021 FC Edmonton team that was not good. So put him on a Pacific team that's actually not terrible, and Easton Ongaro might actually have a shot to finally compete for a CPL Golden Boot. Add to that Stefan Yeats, who was another very good pickup. Great signing, great midfielder from TFC2, had a couple of appearances for Toronto FC last season in MLS. So that is a guy who could be a very good player in the midfield for Pacific this season. My biggest issue of this Pacific squad is that they're relying this season on 2 very young, unproven goaltenders in Emil Gazdov and Kieran Basket. That is a very high risk, high reward situation in net with 2 goalkeepers that are 21 and 19. It's always going to be a very interesting situation when that's your goaltender choices. But overall, I think this Pacific team hasn't really seen a massive decrease from last season. I don't think they've really increased in ability from last season overall, but I think they're definitely good enough to stay in a playoff spot. Moving up to number 4, I have the Cavalry. Cavalry FC lost a couple very important players in the offseason, and guys like David Norman Jr., Karifa Yao, Mason Trafford, they lost some key pieces. And overall, I'm not sure they fully replaced them. Shamit Shome was a very, very nice addition. He was probably the Cavalry's best addition this offseason. Nice, talented midfielder, and another guy who last season with FC Edmonton, again, not much he could do on that squad. So going to Cavalry, where he has an actual team around him, it could be a very nice situation for Shamit Shome, and we could see a bit of a resurgence of his 2019-2020 Montreal Impact form. But the Cavalry are a team who Tommy Wheeldon Jr. is still at the helm. They've kept parts of that core around. They're just a team that consistently performs. Tommy Wheeldon Jr. gets the most of that team. Joe Mason's still there. They still have kept a lot of their very good players. I think this offseason, though, they just kind of stayed in neutral. They didn't really add anything significant. They lost a couple pieces. It was a bit of a neutral offseason for them in a year where a couple teams got significantly better. That just kind of keeps Cavalry in the top 4, but I think not really pushing for the top 3, as already they were like number 3 last season behind Atletico and Forge, and they just didn't really do anything that justifies keeping them in the top 3 of the Canadian Premier League going forward. Which leads me into the top 3. Somehow the 3 Ontario teams are at the top for me. This is not an intention of me being Ontario biased, it's just where I think these 3 teams are right now. My choice for 3rd place this season is York United. York United is another team that had a lot of roster roster turnover. I think they might have had the second most roster turnover besides Halifax. But they are also my clear-cut winners of the offseason in the Canadian Premier League. They add some very talented international player signings of guys like Brem Sumaroro and Lassana Faye. Bring in Clement Bayiha, who is a great fill-in for the right back hole left by Dominic Zator. But I think the biggest factors for the rise of York United this season come from within. First off, Mo Babouli. We have to remember that, yes, they did have him last season, but he only played the last 8 games of the season for York United. And in those 8 games, York was 4-2-2. They only won 9 games all season, but 4 of those 9 wins came in the last 8 games of the season when they had Mo Babouli, and the other 5 only came in the previous 20. So based off of the form they had once they brought in Babouli, had they had him for the whole season, they likely would have been a playoff team last season. So a full season of Mo Babouli is going to turn York into something else entirely. In addition, we have the continued development of Osaze de Rosario. De Rosario last season, he was a young guy, so he was a little streaky in his scoring at times, but he was second in goals in the Canadian Premier League over the course of the year. Young guy, last year was his first full professional season. We can definitely see De Rosario taking another step up. He's definitely a guy who is going to challenge and probably is the favorite for the Golden Boot this season. So just with the additions on the back end, especially that they've made, having Mo Babouli for a whole season and the continued development of Osaze de Rosario, I think this is going to be York's best season in the Canadian Premier League, and I could definitely see them finishing in the top 3. Moving on to number 2, we have Forge FC. 3 titles in the first 4 seasons of the Canadian Premier League, and Forge FC this offseason embraced that, taking a if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach to their team. Only 2 significant outgoing players and only 1 signing so far for Forge, with the season a week away. Out go Daniel Crutzen, who was injured for pretty much all of last season anyway, so he barely played, and out goes Jonathan Grant, who actually joined York. But in typical Forge fashion, the one signing they got was potentially the biggest signing in the Canadian Premier League this offseason, Canadian international defender Manraker James, to a team that was stingent defensively all of last season without a true, real center back playing for them at all. I mean, Alexander Ashinoti Janssen is a midfielder who won Defender of the Year because he was stuck playing center back all of last season with Forge. Now you add Manraker James to that, who's probably the best defender in the Canadian Premier League. This is a Forge team that is going to be very, very hard to score goals against, and then you add that to an offense that has David Chouanier, Tristan Borges, Taron Campbell, who's the CPL's all-time leading scorer, and Rubens Pasillas, who last season was right there neck and neck with Osaze de Rosario all the way. Very, very strong Forge team. And I mean, last season they were second place. This season they have basically the exact same roster, and I'm keeping them in second place. And in first, that just leaves Atletico Ottawa. Ottawa had a bit of a rough start to the offseason with Balou Tabla leaving. That was a massive hole that they needed to fill. But they bring in Jean-Anil Lassie on loan from Montreal, a guy who, maybe not quite yet at Balou Tabla's level, but a very, very talented young player who, if his development path continues with Ottawa this season, he could be a very, very good winger for them and a very nice addition to their attack. Speaking of nice additions to their attack, Samuel Salter, who was 4th in the Golden Boot race last season on a not very good Halifax team. On this Ottawa team, with Ollie Bassett feeding him, Sam Salter could score at an insane rate for Ottawa this season. And last season, remember, Ottawa won the regular season when their out-and-out top striker was Brian Wright, who only had 7 goals in the whole season. So adding a guy who had 11 goals last season on a far weaker team, that is a potentially deadly Ottawa offense. If Ollie Bassett can keep the form he had last season, where he was league MVP, and do it again, Ottawa easily wins the league this season. Yes, they lose Drew Becky on the back end, but they bring in Luke Singh on loan from Toronto. That is a very nice pickup defensively as well. Noel Singh won't replace the leadership and room traits of Becky. He definitely is a very capable player on the pitch and a solid addition to the back line. So that overall is how I think the teams stack up heading into the 2023 CPL regular season. Now, one last quick thing I wanted to write down was my Golden Boot race contenders. If you were paying attention, I already said them all, but my Golden Boot race contenders are as follows: Osaze de Rosario, Sam Salter, Rubens Pasillas, and Easton Ongaro. Now, I just want to note this out because these are all young Canadian strikers, and for the CPL to be in a place where basically the top contenders for the Golden Boot race are all young, early 20s Canadian strikers, that just is an incredible state for the league to be in. Now, of course, there are a couple older or international guys who could toss their hats in the ring, like Mo Babuli, or if he comes back early from injury, Jao Morelli. For the start of the season, these four guys are who I think all have the best shot of winning the Golden Boot this season, and it would not surprise me if at least one or potentially all of them could have fantastic seasons in the CPL this year and all be transferred off to bigger, brighter leagues at the end of the season. So there you have it. That is my preview for the 2023 Canadian Premier League season. Let me know down below in the comments how you think this season is going to play out, if you think I've drastically underrated or overrated any team in the Canadian Premier League this season. And as always, if you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more of my stuff, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. Link is down below in the description, and I will see you next time.